Hey guys, tonight we begin with a journey into the mind-bending world of ancient philosophical schools, where seeking wisdom meant enduring physical torment, psychological manipulation, and social humiliation that would make modern hazing look like a spa day. From the mathematical mysticism of Pythagoras to the cynical public degradations of Diogenes, from the Stoic endurance trials to the mind-breaking paradoxes of the skeptics, these weren't just places of learning, but crucibles of suffering designed to break and remake the human soul. Forget the romanticized vision of toga-draped thinkers calmly debating under olive trees that Hollywood sold you. The truth? You probably wouldn't last a single day in these crucibles of so-called enlightenment. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights and make yourselves comfortable, and let's begin tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up as a new initiate in a 6th century BCE Pythagorean compound in southern Italy. The good news? You've been accepted into one of the most prestigious philosophical schools of the ancient world. The bad news? Your enlightenment begins with pure, unadulterated suffering. It's still dark outside when a senior disciple shakes you awake. Your eyes burn from lack of sleep. You were up until midnight performing complex mathematical calculations by oil lamp. Your back aches from sleeping on a thin reed mat spread over a stone floor. There's no pillow, that would be too comfortable, and comfort is the enemy of philosophical progress. The room is packed with other initiates, all men, all as disheveled and disoriented as you are. The air reeks of sweat, oil lamps, and the sour tang of fear. Fear of failure. Fear of punishment. Fear of Pythagoras himself, the master whose word is quite literally law within these walls. You're not allowed to speak. Not today, not tomorrow, not for the next 5 years. That's right. 5 years of complete silence is your first test as a Pythagorean initiate. They call it acousmatikoi, the listeners. You will only listen and observe until the masters deem you worthy of speech. Any sound from your lips, a question, a complaint, even a sneeze that sounds suspiciously voluntary, will result in immediate punishment. And Pythagorean punishment isn't detention or writing lines, it's public flogging, days without food, or being forced to stand motionless from sunrise to sunset while senior disciples berate your intellectual inadequacies. Some say those who commit grave infractions simply disappear, their names never mentioned again. As you rise from your mat, your stomach growls. Get used to that feeling. Breakfast isn't coming. The Pythagoreans believe in strict dietary regimens. No meat, obviously. Meat belongs to animals with souls. But also no beans. Yes, beans. Pythagoras has forbidden them completely, claiming they contain the souls of the dead. Or perhaps because their shape resembles testicles or embryos. The explanation changes depending on who you ask, but the punishment for eating a bean remains the same: expulsion, or worse. Your morning begins with a ritual immersion in cold water, not for cleanliness, but to shock your system into philosophical alertness. The water hits your skin like needles. Your breath catches and your muscles seize. The senior disciple watches, making sure you don't flinch or gasp. Self-tranquility begins with the body. If you can't master your physical reactions, you'll never master your mind. And this is just how your day starts. It only gets worse from here. After your icy baptism, still shivering and unable to speak, you follow the other initiates to the eastern courtyard for morning contemplation. You're soaking wet, the dawn breeze cutting through your thin linen tunic like a knife. But complaining isn't an option. Not that you could anyway, bound by your vow of silence. The morning sun breaks over the horizon, and all disciples turn to face it. This isn't casual sun worship. You must stand perfectly straight, feet together, arms at your sides, eyes locked on the blinding orb as it rises. Try looking away, even for a second, and a senior member will jab you in the ribs with a wooden staff, leaving bruises that will last for weeks. Sunlight, mixed with pain, is apparently the perfect recipe for philosophical illumination. Your legs begin to cramp after 20 minutes of motionless standing, but relief isn't coming. The Pythagoreans believe physical discomfort is the gateway to mental clarity. The body is a prison, they say, though they seem determined to make it more of a torture chamber. Now comes the recitation of the acousmata, the cryptic sayings of Pythagoras that all disciples must memorize. Don't stir fire with a knife. Don't urinate toward the sun. Abstain from beans. The senior members chant these maxims while you listen in silence, expected to absorb every word. Miss one during tomorrow's recitation test, which you'll answer through gestures, of course, and you'll find yourself standing in the corner holding heavy rocks above your head until your arms feel like they're being torn from their sockets. Your stomach is now actively protesting its emptiness, but breakfast still isn't coming. Food is restricted to a single modest meal in the late afternoon. Water is available, but only at specified times and in limited quantities. Thirst, like hunger, is considered a distraction to be conquered, not a need to be satisfied. After the sun ritual comes physical training. If you thought philosophers were just thinkers, Pythagoras would like a word, or rather he wouldn't, since he rarely speaks directly to new initiates. The Pythagoreans believe a sound mind requires a sound body, and they take this to extremes that would make modern CrossFit enthusiasts weep. Barefoot running on sharp gravel, wrestling on hard-packed dirt that tears skin with every fall, lifting stones of increasing weight until your muscles scream, all performed in silence, with perfect form. Falter in your movements, show any sign of weakness, and the wooden staff finds your ribs, your back, your legs, wherever will cause pain without causing injury serious enough to interfere with tomorrow's training. The physical exertion might be bearable if you were properly fed and rested. You're neither. Your stomach is empty, your throat parched, your muscles already aching from yesterday's regimen. And remember, you cannot ask questions, cannot request clarification, cannot express pain or confusion or doubt. You can only observe, imitate, and endure. The sun climbs higher, beating down mercilessly. Sweat soaks your tunic, stinging the scrapes and bruises accumulated during training. Your fellow initiates look equally miserable, though they've learned to hide it better than you. Some have been here for months, their faces already taking on the hollow-eyed, fanatically focused look of the senior disciples. After physical training comes the cleaning of the compound. Philosophical enlightenment apparently requires immaculate floors. You're handed a crude brush made from stiff fibres and a bucket of cold water. Your section is the main hall, a space the size of a modern tennis court, with a stone floor that must be scrubbed until it gleams. Your knees, already raw from previous days' work, press painfully against the hard surface as you scrub. A senior disciple paces behind you, occasionally stopping to run his finger along the floor you've just cleaned. If it comes up with the slightest trace of dust, you'll start again from the beginning. This isn't just about cleanliness, it's about breaking your will, teaching you that true wisdom begins when the ego is crushed into submission, and your day has barely begun. The real philosophical training, the mental trials and intellectual humiliations that make the physical discomfort seem merciful by comparison, still await. By mid-morning, your knees are bleeding from scrubbing floors, your back aches from physical training, and your mind feels foggy from hunger and thirst. Perfect conditions, the Pythagoreans believe, for beginning your intellectual education. You're led to a small, windowless room with other first-year initiates. The air is stifling, thick with the smell of oil lamps and unwashed bodies. In the centre sits an older disciple, his face gaunt, eyes burning with the peculiar intensity that comes from years of mathematical contemplation and self-denial. He poses a question. What is the perfect number? You don't know the answer. You couldn't respond anyway due to your vow of silence, but your confusion is evident on your face. The master doesn't explain, doesn't elaborate. He simply repeats the question, his voice growing harder. Other students are staring at you now, their expressions ranging from pity to contempt. This is the Pythagorean educational method. Cryptic questions, no guidance, and public shame for those who fail to intuit the answers. After several excruciating minutes, the master tells you the answer is 10, formed by the sum of 1, 2, 3, and 4, the sacred tetractes. You're expected to remember this, along with dozens of other mathematical and philosophical principles that will be thrown at you with minimal explanation. And God's help you if you forget. Memory training is central to Pythagorean education, but it's not gentle flashcards and mnemonic devices. Each evening, before sleep, you must recite everything you've learned that day, in perfect order, without hesitation. Stumble, forget, or misstate a principle, and you'll spend the night standing in the courtyard, regardless of weather, repeating the forgotten lesson until dawn breaks. The intellectual torment continues with geometry. Pythagoras and his followers are obsessed with it, seeing in mathematical relationships the very structure of reality. You're handed a crude stylus and a wax tablet, expected to solve increasingly complex geometric problems with no instruction beyond watching demonstrations once. Get it wrong, and you'll wear a special wooden collar, the dunce board, around your neck for the rest of the day, marking you as intellectually inferior. The collar is heavy, digging into your shoulders and chafing your neck raw. It's designed not just to shame, but to physically pain you, a constant reminder of your failure. Other students avoid you while you wear it, as if intellectual inadequacy might be contagious. After hours of mathematical torment comes the most dreaded exercise of all: public interrogation. The senior disciples gather all new initiates in the main hall. One by one, you're brought forward and asked to solve problems or explain principles through gestures and drawings, still bound by silence. It's your turn. You step forward, legs trembling slightly from exhaustion and hunger. The master presents a geometric proof you've never seen before. You stare at it, panic rising in your throat. Other students watch, their faces carefully blank. Some will secretly rejoice in your failure. It means they won't be the worst today. You attempt to work through the proof on your wax tablet, your hand shaking. The stylus slips, scratching an erroneous line. The master's eyes narrow. He takes the tablet, holds it up for all to see, and slowly, deliberately, breaks it in half. The crack echoes in the silent hall. Your punishment is immediate and humiliating. You must stand in the center of the room while each of your fellow students approaches and draws a line on your forehead with charcoal. A mark of intellectual shame that you'll wear until you're permitted to wash it off. Possibly days from now. But the physical discomfort and public shame pale compared to the mental anguish. The Pythagoreans excel at creating philosophical paradoxes and koans designed to break your mental models and rebuild them according to their doctrine. They'll pose questions with no correct answers, then punish you regardless of your response. They'll present mathematical problems that seem solvable but aren't, watching as you drive yourself to exhaustion trying to resolve them. This mental torture isn't random cruelty, it's methodical deconstruction of your previous ways of thinking. The goal is to break your mind's attachment to conventional logic, preparing it for the secret mathematical doctrines that form the core of Pythagorean wisdom. But the process feels like drowning, over and over, always just short of the final breath. And you still haven't eaten today. Midday arrives, marked not by food, but by the transition to your most challenging ordeal yet, the discipline of silence. For new initiates, the prohibition against speaking isn't just about listening and learning, it's an active form of psychological torture, ingeniously disguised as spiritual practice. You're now led to what the Pythagoreans call the chamber of reflection, a bare room where initiates sit in absolute silence for hours, contemplating a single object placed in the center. Today it's a simple bronze sphere. You must sit cross-legged, back straight, hands on your knees, eyes fixed on the sphere, without moving, without speaking, without even clearing your throat. The physical discomfort becomes excruciating after the first hour. Your legs go numb, then painful, then numb again. Your back spasms. Your throat itches desperately, but to cough or swallow too loudly brings swift punishment. A senior disciple circulates silently around the room, carrying a thin reed. If you shift position, if your eyes wander, if you make any sound at all, the reed whistles through the air and stings across your shoulders or the back of your neck. What makes this silence truly torturous isn't just the physical stillness, it's the psychological isolation. You have questions burning in your mind. You've witnessed things that make no sense. You're hungry, thirsty, confused, and in pain. But you cannot ask for explanation, cannot seek clarification, cannot even grunt in acknowledgement when instructions are given. The silence creates a peculiar kind of loneliness, even in a room full of people. You begin to feel invisible, your identity erased by your inability to express yourself. Thoughts circle your mind like trapped birds, growing more frantic with nowhere to go. Some initiates describe feeling like they're slowly disappearing, becoming hollow vessels rather than thinking beings. This is precisely the goal. Pythagoras believed that through enforced silence, the student's ego would gradually dissolve, allowing true wisdom to enter. What he didn't advertise was the psychological damage that often accompanied this dissolution. The anxiety, disorientation, and crisis of identity that many initiates experienced. After 3 hours of silent contemplation, your ordeal intensifies. A senior disciple enters with a scroll and reads complex philosophical propositions aloud. Some are obvious falsehoods, some contain subtle errors, some are true but counterintuitive. You're expected to recognize truth from falsehood, but cannot indicate your understanding or confusion verbally. Here's the trap. If you show any reaction at all, a widening of the eyes at an absurdity, a slight nod at a truth, you're instantly punished for breaking perfect stillness. But if you maintain complete impassivity, you're later punished for failing to intellectually engage with the material. It's a no-win situation designed to teach you that all expectations are traps, all reactions are weaknesses. The silence extends beyond the reflection chamber. At all times, you must communicate through gestures or writing, but even these are restricted. There's an approved sign language for basic needs: water, toilet, pain. But philosophical questions must be written, submitted to senior disciples, and may or may not receive answers, often days later. This communication barrier creates a dangerous situation. If you misunderstand an instruction, you cannot ask for clarification. If you're in pain beyond the ordinary discomfort expected of initiates, you might not have the approved gesture to express it. Some students have endured serious medical issues rather than risk breaking silence to seek help. The social isolation is perhaps the cruelest aspect. Humans are social creatures, and speech is our primary connection. Without it, you become a ghost among the living. Other initiates, even those who arrived with you, grow distant. You begin to forget the sound of your own voice. Some long-term initiates report having dreams where they're screaming, only to wake to the same enforced silence. After 5 years of this, yes, 5 years, those who remain are granted limited speaking privileges. By then, many have developed a stutter or speaking anxiety that remains for life. Others become pathologically quiet, having internalized silence as virtue to an extreme degree. The Pythagoreans consider these speech impediments signs of philosophical progress, evidence that the initiate has learned to think before speaking. As the day wears on, your throat feels tight, your jaw stiff from disuse. You begin to panic at the realization that tomorrow will bring the same silence, and the day after, and the day after that, stretching into years of isolation within a crowd. You wonder if you'll remember how to speak when finally permitted. You wonder if you'll have anything left to say. And through it all, the physical discomforts continue, hunger gnawing at your stomach, thirst scratching your throat, muscles aching from enforced stillness. The Pythagoreans don't just want your silence, they want it given from a body in distress, a mind under pressure. Only then, they believe, is it truly valuable. This isn't philosophy, this is breaking a human being and reassembling the pieces into the shape of a Pythagorean. Physical. Nowadays, I bet you don't even want the pieces into the shape of a Pythagorean. The sun has passed its zenith, and your empty stomach has gone from painful growling to a hollow ache that radiates through your entire body. At last, the moment for the single daily meal arrives, but like everything in a Pythagorean compound, food isn't just sustenance. It's another vehicle for punishment, control, and philosophical enlightenment. You and the other initiates are led to a plain courtyard where ceramic bowls await, each containing an identical portion of food. It's a miserable sight. A small mound of barley, a few raw vegetables, a dollop of olive oil, and water. No salt, no herbs, no cooking. The blandness is by design. Pythagoreans believe that seeking pleasure in food distracts from philosophical pursuits. But before you can eat even this pitiful meal, you must undergo the food examination. A senior disciple inspects your bowl, looking for forbidden items. Though the meal was prepared by the school, this ritual humiliation serves to remind initiates of dietary restrictions. The inspector pokes through your food, making a show of checking for beans, those mysteriously forbidden legumes that could get you expelled. Or worse, finding your meal appropriately austere and bean-free, the senior disciple nods. You're allowed to eat, but not before a lengthy prayer thanking the gods and Pythagoras himself for this bounty. The prayer drags on while your stomach cramps painfully. Some initiates have fainted during these ceremonies, their weakened bodies unable to remain standing. Those who fall are denied their meal entirely, a collapse indicating insufficient philosophical strength. Finally permitted to eat, you face a new challenge. You must consume your food in complete silence, taking small, measured bites. Eat too quickly, a sign of gluttony, and a disciple will snatch your bowl away. Make any sound while chewing, a lack of discipline, and you'll be forced to spit out your food and continue the meal with a reduced portion. Finish too quickly, and you'll stand hungry while others eat. Finish too slowly, and your food will be taken before you're done. The meal itself is nutritionally inadequate, high in grain, low in protein, fat and calories. It's designed to keep initiates in a constant state of mild hunger, supposedly sharpening the mind by denying the body. In reality, it leads to fatigue, difficulty concentrating, and a particular kind of brain fog that makes the complex mathematical training even more challenging. Some schools of Pythagoreans practice even stricter dietary penalties. Certain branches abstain from all animal products, others from wine, still others from particular plants deemed too passionate or too grounding. Some initiates are assigned personalized food restrictions as punishment for intellectual failures. No olives for a month if you fail a geometry test. No oil if you forget the master's teachings. The Cynics, another philosophical school whose practices you might encounter, take dietary punishment in a different direction. While not as mathematically rigid as the Pythagoreans, They specialize in public humiliation. A cynic initiate might be forced to eat like a dog, from the ground, in the public market. Others must beg for food, accepting whatever scraps and insults are thrown their way. One famous cynic practice involves deliberately eating food that has been trampled or spat upon to demonstrate liberation from social convention. If you think Pythagorean or cynic food practices are severe, count yourself lucky you're not in a late Orphic or mystery cult school, where initiates might fast completely for days before major ceremonies, their hunger-induced hallucinations interpreted as divine visions. Some mystery cults practice sympathetic consumption, forcing initiates to eat items that symbolize death or divine suffering, often disgusting or potentially dangerous substances. Your meal today has an additional punishment component. One initiate made a mathematical error during morning lessons, so everyone's portions are reduced by 1/3. Collective punishment is common, fostering an atmosphere where students police each other's behavior and performance. Make too many mistakes, and you'll find yourself socially isolated, other initiates avoiding you for fear of shared consequences. As you choke down the bland, insufficient meal, you notice certain senior disciples receiving slightly different food, a bit of honey perhaps, or a piece of cheese. These small privileges are dangled before initiates as rewards for years of perfect obedience. The hierarchy is reinforced through food, with the inner circle enjoying modest improvements, while new students suffer deliberate deprivation. The meal ends too quickly, leaving you still hungry. Water is served sparingly, just enough to prevent dangerous dehydration, not enough to feel satisfied. Some philosophical schools believe thirst, like hunger, brings clarity. Others simply use control of water as another tool of dominance. Before the eating area is cleared, a senior disciple delivers a lecture on the spiritual properties of food, how certain items burden the soul while others lighten it. The lecture is patently absurd by modern nutritional standards, but to question it, even silently with a raised eyebrow, is to invite punishment. You must nod in apparent understanding, despite your gnawing hunger and the weakness spreading through your limbs. As you rise from the meal, light-headed and still hungry, you realize food has been transformed from basic sustenance into an instrument of control. By controlling what enters your body, when and how, the school controls your energy levels, your mental clarity, and ultimately your capacity for resistance. It's a sophistication of cruelty disguised as purification. And despite the inadequate meal, the most mentally and physically demanding portions of your day are still ahead. As the afternoon wears on, your growling stomach and light head are the least of your concerns. The sun has begun its descent, but your day is far from over. Now comes the most mentally grueling part of your philosophical training. Sleep deprivation disguised as intellectual enlightenment. The Pythagoreans, like many ancient philosophical schools, view sleep as a form of weakness, a necessary evil that should be minimized and controlled. Plato's academy isn't much better, with its night-long dialectical sessions deliberately scheduled to push students to their mental limits. But it's the Stoics who truly elevate sleep deprivation to an art form, seeing it as an opportunity to practice endurance in the face of discomfort. You're led to another bare room, where senior disciples are already setting up for the evening contemplation. This innocuous-sounding session is actually a brutal exercise in forced wakefulness. You'll sit in the same cross-legged position from earlier, back straight despite your exhausted muscles, eyes open despite their burning dryness. A senior disciple will read philosophical texts aloud, droning, complex, often deliberately monotonous passages designed to induce drowsiness while demanding attention. The rules are simple and merciless. If you fall asleep, you're awakened with a splash of cold water or a sharp prod from a staff. After 3 such awakenings, you're forced to stand for the remainder of the session, which typically lasts until midnight. If you fall asleep standing, a skill some desperate initiates actually develop, you'll spend the next day wearing the wooden sleep collar, a heavy device that makes it impossible to rest your head in any position. What makes this ordeal particularly cruel is that it's not just one night. Philosophical schools systematically disrupt sleep patterns, creating a state of perpetual exhaustion that makes initiates more susceptible to indoctrination. Some schools, particularly those influenced by Orphic mysteries, wake students at irregular intervals for night revelations, cryptic teachings supposedly more potent when delivered to a mind weakened by sleep deprivation. The philosopher must master sleep, not be mastered by it, drones the senior disciple, his own eyes suspiciously alert despite the late hour. Some whisper that advanced members use stimulants, certain herbs or fungal preparations, to maintain wakefulness while forcing exhaustion on their students. The inequality of suffering is part of the hierarchical design. As the night progresses, you enter a strange, hallucinatory state. The boundary between waking and dreaming blurs. The philosophical texts seem to shift meaning, words transforming into abstract patterns. This mental fog isn't an unfortunate side effect. It's the intended goal. Many philosophical schools believe that insights emerge when rational thought is suspended, when the mind is too exhausted to maintain its usual defenses. There's a sinister genius to this system. Sleep deprivation doesn't just make you tired, it fundamentally alters brain chemistry. It impairs judgment, weakens critical thinking, and increases suggestibility. Modern cults and military interrogators know this. Ancient philosophers discovered it through trial and error. The exhausted mind accepts teachings it would otherwise question, surrenders to authority it might otherwise challenge. For those who do manage to sleep, another form of philosophical torment awaits: mandatory dream reporting. Each morning, initiates must recount their dreams to senior disciples who interpret them according to the school's doctrine. Dreams of flying might indicate dangerous ambition. Dreams of water could signal moral dissolution. Certain dreams are deemed impure and require ritual purification, usually involving further physical discomfort. The Neoplatonists are particularly obsessed with dream interpretation, seeing the dream world as a gateway to higher realms. Having the wrong dreams can result in additional fasting, cold water immersions, or solitary confinement. Some initiates begin fabricating dreams that align with expectations, only to be punished when their false reports contain inconsistencies. Perhaps most disturbing are the sleep rituals of certain mystery schools, where initiates are woken at precisely calculated astronomical moments, midnight, specific planetary alignments, or dawn, and subjected to disorienting ceremonies involving rapid spinning, flickering lights, or exposure to aromatic smoke. These rituals, conducted when the mind is most vulnerable, create powerful psychic impressions that can permanently alter an initiate's perception of reality. By the time midnight approaches, you're barely conscious. Your eyes stay open through sheer terror of punishment, but your mind drifts in and out of awareness. The words being read become meaningless sound, your body a collection of dull aches rather than a unified whole. You've entered what philosophers proudly call the liminal state, the threshold between normal consciousness and something else. Modern psychologists would recognize it as a stress response to prolonged sleep deprivation. In this vulnerable state, the real indoctrination begins. The droning philosophical texts give way to the school's core doctrines, repeated in simple, rhythmic phrases designed to implant themselves in your fractured consciousness. These aren't presented as ideas to be considered, but as truths to be absorbed. Your critical faculties too damaged by exhaustion to mount resistance, these seeds planted in fertile ground. When you're finally permitted to retire to your sleeping mat, you'll have perhaps 4 hours before the morning wake-up. Just enough to prevent complete physical collapse, not enough for proper rest or dream cycles. The next day will begin with the same cold water shock, the same hunger, the same silence, but now layered onto existing exhaustion, creating a cumulative effect that breaks even the strongest wills over time. This isn't education. This isn't philosophy. This is systematic sleep torture, dressed in intellectual robes, designed not to enlighten, but to transform initiates into perfect vessels for the school's doctrines. And it works with terrifying efficiency. As you struggle to keep your eyes open, watching others succumb to exhaustion and receive their punishments, you begin to wonder, how many of the great philosophical insights were actually the hallucinations of sleep-deprived minds? And how many renowned philosophers were simply those who survived the torment with enough of their sanity intact to write it down? Dawn arrives after your brutally abbreviated sleep, and with it comes a new form of philosophical torment, property renunciation. The Pythagoreans share this practice with the Cynics, though with different justifications and methods. Today, you'll learn firsthand why philosophical enlightenment apparently requires material poverty. You're roused from your sleeping mat, that thin reed barrier between your aching body and the stone floor, and immediately led to the central courtyard. There, a senior disciple announces that today is a possession examination day. Your heart sinks. You've heard whispers about these inspections from other initiates, none of them good. First comes the public inventory, any items you've managed to keep, a small memento from home, an extra tunic, perhaps a treasured amulet, must be displayed before the entire school. Each item is held up, examined, and its necessity questioned. The process is deliberately humiliating, your attachments and sentimentality exposed for public scrutiny. "What is this?" demands the senior disciple, holding up a small carved wooden bird your father gave you before you left home. You cannot speak to explain its significance. Remember, you're still bound by the vow of silence. You can only watch, as it's declared, an unnecessary attachment to the material world, and added to a growing pile of confiscated items. The Pythagoreans believed that material possessions tether the soul to the physical plane, preventing philosophical transcendence. They're not alone in this view. The Cynics take it even further, celebrating poverty as virtue and rejecting even basic comforts. Diogenes, the infamous Cynic philosopher, lived in a ceramic tub in the public square, owning nothing but a cloak, a staff, and a bowl which he discarded after seeing a child drink with cupped hands. Your inspection continues. That extra pair of sandals. Confiscated, 1 pair is sufficient. The small knife you use for eating. Taken, hands were made before cutlery. Even your clay water cup is questioned, though ultimately allowed, since the alternative, drinking directly from communal vessels, presents hygiene concerns even Pythagoreans recognize. The truly sadistic aspect isn't just the taking of your possessions, it's what happens to them afterward. Items deemed frivolous aren't stored away, they're destroyed in front of you. Your wooden bird is snapped in half, the pieces tossed into the cooking fire. Other initiates' treasures meet similar fates, cloth torn, ceramics smashed, small luxuries like combs or mirrors deliberately broken. This destruction serves multiple purposes. It demonstrates the impermanence of material things, yes, but it also severs your connection to your previous life, your family, your individual identity. Without personal possessions, you become more fully absorbed into the philosophical collective, your individuality erased in favor of doctrine. For particularly stubborn initiates who cling to material comfort, there are specialized punishments. Some philosophical schools practice what they call reversal teaching, forcing a wealthy initiate to beg in the streets, wearing rags, experiencing the contempt society shows to the destitute. Others require manual labor in conditions of deliberate discomfort, hauling water in leaky vessels or sweeping courtyards with inadequate tools. The cynics elevate material punishment to public spectacle. If you were unfortunate enough to study under Diogenes, rather than Pythagoras, you might be ordered to drag a heavy object, perhaps a cabbage tied to a string, through the market square, enduring the mockery of onlookers. When questioned, you must respond that you're practicing uselessness, demonstrating the arbitrary nature of social convention. The psychological toll of such public humiliation is immense, but considered essential to breaking the ego's attachment to dignity. Even the Stoics and Epicureans, often considered more moderate philosophical schools, practice material deprivation. Seneca, despite his personal wealth, regularly practiced poverty, sleeping on hard surfaces, wearing plain clothing, and eating simple food, to demonstrate that such conditions hold no terror for the philosopher. The difference is that for Stoics, this practice is preparation for misfortune, while for Pythagoreans, it's punishment for being insufficiently detached. After the possession examination, you're assigned additional simplification duties, tasks designed to reinforce your new state of material deprivation. You must wash your single tunic in cold water and wear it wet. You must sleep directly on the stone floor tonight, your sleeping mat temporarily confiscated. You must eat your meal from your hands rather than a bowl, hunched over like an animal. These aren't random cruelties. They're calculated steps in breaking down your identification with physical comfort, your sense of yourself as a body rather than a mind. The philosophical schools understand something that modern cult deprogrammers would recognize instantly. A person deprived of personal possessions, adequate sleep, proper nutrition, and basic dignity becomes malleable, desperate for approval, willing to embrace whatever worldview offers structure and meaning. As the day wears on, you feel strangely lighter without your few possessions, but also more dependent on the school itself. Without even basic personal items, You rely entirely on what's provided. Your tunic, your food, your water, your sleeping space. All can be given or taken at the whim of senior disciples. This complete dependence creates a powerful psychological bond, a twisted gratitude toward those who control your most basic needs. This is the dark genius of philosophical property punishment. It masquerades as spiritual teaching while functioning as a control mechanism. By the time evening approaches, the broken bird has become a metaphor for something larger, the deliberate shattering of your former self, piece by piece, to make room for the philosopher they intend you to become. As the afternoon progresses, you're finally permitted to rest, not out of mercy, but because you'll need your strength for what comes next, public humiliation. If you thought the property confiscation was degrading, it was merely a warm-up for the calculated social degradation that forms the backbone of many philosophical training regimens. The Cynics are undisputed masters of this practice, but the Pythagoreans have their own version, as do the Stoics, and even the relatively moderate Peripatetics. Each school employs public humiliation with a slightly different philosophical justification, but the psychological impact remains the same: to break your social identity, strip away your dignity, and rebuild you according to their specifications. You're led to the town's marketplace, yes, outside the philosophical compound, where ordinary citizens shop, gossip, and go about their business. This isn't a private humiliation, it's deliberately public. The senior disciples arrange themselves in a loose circle, and you're placed in the center, like an animal in an arena. Today we address the problem of pride, announces the lead disciple. Your stomach tightens. You've seen this ritual performed on others, and now it's your turn. What follows is a systematic dismantling of your character, conducted as calmly as a geometry lesson. Every flaw, every mistake, every perceived weakness you've shown since joining the school is enumerated in excruciating detail. Your mathematical errors, your momentary lapses in physical discipline, the slight grimace you made during yesterday's cold water immersion, all are presented as evidence of your philosophical inadequacy. This isn't constructive criticism, it's character assassination, disguised as teaching, and you must stand there, silent due to your vow, unable to defend yourself or provide context. Worse still, the public setting means ordinary citizens stop to watch, some smirking at your discomfort, others shaking their heads in pity. The philosophical schools are respected but also feared in ancient communities. Everyone knows about their strange practices, and few want to interfere. Had you chosen the Cynic path rather than the Pythagorean, your humiliation would be even more extreme. Diogenes was notorious for ordering his students to perform degrading acts in public, dragging fish through the marketplace on a string, wearing clothing inside out, or begging from statues. When they inevitably attracted mockery, they were forbidden to respond or explain. The lesson? Social approval is meaningless. Convention is arbitrary. Even the Stoics, with their emphasis on dignity, use public humiliation as a teaching tool. Epictetus reportedly instructed students to deliberately wear mismatched or inappropriate clothing, then sit in public places, enduring stares and whispers without reaction. The goal was to separate self-worth from public opinion, a noble aim achieved through painful means. Your own humiliation takes a more targeted form. After the public recitation of your failings, you're ordered to perform a series of increasingly absurd tasks. Count the stones in a section of pavement while market-goers step around you. Stand perfectly still, holding a heavy jug of water, while a senior disciple slowly pours wine into a cup, requiring absolute steadiness to avoid spillage. Recite mathematical sequences through hand gestures, while children mock your strange movements. Each task is designed to be just difficult enough that you'll likely fail, providing opportunities for further correction and criticism. It's a no-win scenario, carefully engineered to reinforce your incompetence and the school's authority. The psychological mechanics at work here are sophisticated. By placing you in situations where you're publicly shamed, the school creates a powerful emotional association between social independence and pain. The only relief from this shame comes from within the philosophical community itself. When you're eventually allowed to return to the compound, the relative absence of active humiliation feels like acceptance, even warmth. This alternation between public shame and private inclusion creates a dependency relationship. You begin to view the philosophical school not as the source of your suffering, but as a refuge from the outside world where you were humiliated. The fact that the school orchestrated that humiliation fades from consciousness, replaced by gratitude for the sanctuary it provides. As the afternoon wears on, your public ordeal finally ends. You're physically exhausted, emotionally drained, and psychologically disoriented. The senior disciples collect you like a piece of equipment that served its purpose and lead you back to the compound. Some initiates are so traumatized by these public humiliations that they develop lasting social anxiety, becoming increasingly dependent on the philosophical community as the only place they feel safe. This isn't an unfortunate side effect, it's the intended outcome. Philosophical schools don't just want to teach you, they want to own you, to become your entire world. Public humiliation ensures that the outside world becomes something to fear rather than an escape option. Back at the compound, you're given a brief period of reflection, sitting alone in a corner, contemplating your failures and the lessons they supposedly taught. In your exhausted, humiliated state, you're more likely to internalize the school's messaging, that your suffering has purpose, that your humiliation is enlightenment, that surrender is wisdom. This is where philosophy bleeds into something darker, not the love of wisdom its name suggests, but the systematic application of psychological techniques to break and rebuild human beings. And your day of punishments is still far from over. Evening approaches, but rest remains a distant promise. Now comes the portion of philosophical training most schools share regardless of their doctrinal differences. Physical hardening through deliberate pain and discomfort. The Stoics call it voluntary hardship, the Cynics natural living, and the Pythagoreans bodily purification. Whatever the label, the reality is the same. Controlled physical suffering as philosophical practice. You're led to an open courtyard where other initiates have already gathered, their faces taut with anticipation and dread. A senior disciple stands before a brazier of hot coals, the orange glow illuminating his severe features. Beside him lies an assortment of implements, switches made from flexible wood, rough cloths, stone weights, and jars of what you'll soon discover is salted water. The body is the first battlefield of philosophy, he intones. Before the mind can be disciplined, the flesh must be conquered. This mantra, repeated in various forms across philosophical schools, justifies what comes next. Systematic physical discomfort, labelled as training. The Stoics are perhaps the most theoretically sophisticated about pain practice. They distinguish between preferred indifference, health, comfort, and dispreferred indifference, health, sickness, pain, arguing that virtue alone is good and vice alone is evil. Everything else, including physical suffering, is morally neutral. This elegant philosophical framework provides the perfect justification for inflicting precisely that morally neutral suffering on initiates. The evening's training begins with exposure exercises. You're ordered to remove your tunic, standing exposed to the evening air. In summer, this might be merely uncomfortable, but in winter or early spring, it's genuinely painful. Your skin prickles with goosebumps, muscles tensing against the cold. Senior disciples circulate, watching for signs of shivering, a weakness that earns immediate correction, usually in the form of cold water poured over the head. Next comes contact endurance. You kneel on hard gravel, not large stones that would cause injury, but small, angular pieces that dig painfully into your skin. The position must be maintained perfectly. Back straight, arms at sides, eyes forward. Any adjustment, any attempt to shift weight from one knee to the other is met with a sharp switch across the shoulders or back. Pain is opinion, quotes the senior disciple, paraphrasing Epictetus. Suffering exists only in the mind. These philosophical platitudes might be true for the seasoned practitioner who has internalized Stoic doctrines, but for you, hungry, exhausted, cold and in pain, they're empty words contradicted by your screaming nerve endings. After kneeling comes the salt cloth discipline. Rough fabric soaked in salt water is vigorously rubbed against your skin, not hard enough to break the surface, but certainly enough to create a burning sensation that lingers for hours. This practice, derived from athletic training but repurposed for philosophical hardening, particularly targets areas where skin is thin or sensitive. Some initiates, unable to endure silently, whimper or gasp. These sounds are met with immediate escalation, the salt cloth applied more vigorously, the position held longer. The lesson is clear. Expressing pain only increases it. True philosophical discipline requires not just enduring suffering, but doing so with perfect composure. The Cynics take physical hardening to exhibitionistic extremes. Diogenes was famous for embracing statue in winter and rolling in hot sand in summer. His followers were expected to do likewise, deliberately seeking out physical discomfort as proof of their liberation from convention. Stories tell of Cynic philosophers sleeping on bare ground during snowstorms or standing motionless in summer heat until their skin blistered, all to demonstrate that nature, not comfort, was the proper state of humankind. Your own ordeal continues with weight training, not the modern practice for building muscle, but an ancient exercise in endurance. Heavy stone weights are placed in your outstretched hands, arms extended parallel to the ground. You must hold this position without wavering, the weight gradually pulling at your shoulder sockets, tremors building in your muscles. Sweat beads on your forehead despite the cool air, salt stinging your eyes. Minutes stretch like hours. Your arms begin to shake uncontrollably. The senior disciple watches impassively. This isn't about building strength. It's about transcending physical limitations through sheer will. When your arms finally give out, the weight's crashing to the ground. You're not permitted rest. Instead, you're assigned a recovery discipline, running in circles around the courtyard, muscles screaming, until the disciple decides you've learned whatever lesson failure was supposed to teach. The physical ordeals aren't random torments, but carefully designed escalations. They begin with discomfort you can reasonably endure, gradually increasing until you reach your breaking point. This calibrated approach ensures you experience not just pain but the psychological crisis of reaching your perceived limits and then being forced beyond them. For the Pythagoreans, this crisis has mystical significance. They believe that when the body surrenders, when physical resistance collapses, the soul becomes momentarily visible, like sediment settling in water. What modern psychologists might recognize as dissociation or endorphin-induced altered states, the ancient philosophers interpreted as glimpses of the true self, freed from bodily constraints. As darkness falls, the physical disciplines reach their culmination in what some schools call the vigil, standing perfectly still, arms outstretched in a cruciform position, while reciting mathematical sequences or philosophical maxims. Your muscles, already exhausted from the day's ordeals, scream in protest. The position cuts off circulation, creating burning sensations in your extremities. Your mind clouds with exhaustion. This is the moment the philosophical schools wait for, when physical distress creates a particular kind of surrender, a dissociative state where the initiate becomes highly receptive to suggestion. In this vulnerable condition, core doctrines are recited, fundamental teachings implanted. Modern psychologists would recognize this as a form of conditioning, associating relief from pain with acceptance of the school's worldview. Finally, just as you think you can endure no more, the evening's training ends. But there's no warm bath, no soothing ointment for abraded skin, no gentle recovery. You're simply dismissed to your sleeping mat, aching, exhausted, and fundamentally altered by the experience. This pattern, repeated daily or weekly depending on the school's specific practices, gradually transforms initiates from independent individuals into philosophical soldiers, their bodies as disciplined as their minds. What's most disturbing about these physical practices isn't their severity but their effectiveness. Modern research on hazing, indoctrination, and group cohesion confirms what ancient philosophers discovered through trial and error. Shared physical suffering creates powerful bonds between initiates while increasing commitment to the group's ideologies. Pain doesn't just break resistance, it builds allegiance. As you collapse onto your sleeping mat, muscles twitching, skin burning, mind floating in a strange liminal space between awareness and unconsciousness, you're not just physically exhausted, you're being systematically transformed. Your identity rebuilding around the philosophical principles that justified your suffering. And tomorrow, it begins again. Dawn has barely broken when you're woken for yet another day of philosophical enlightenment. But today brings a different kind of ordeal, one that strikes at the core of human experience, relationship control. Ancient philosophical schools didn't just regulate what you thought or how you behaved, they systematically managed whom and how you loved. Sexual regulation varied dramatically between schools but was universally controlling. The Pythagoreans imposed strict sexual abstinence on initiates, sometimes for years. The Stoics permitted sex but stripped it of passion, reducing it to a functional act for procreation. The Cynics took the opposite approach, arguing that natural impulses should be satisfied without shame, but deliberately in ways that shocked conventional society. You're summoned to a special gathering of all initiates, segregated by gender. The senior disciples announce that today's teaching concerns the management of carnal impulses. What follows is not sexual education but sexual control, wrapped in philosophical justification. For male initiates in Pythagorean schools, the message is absolute. Sexual activity depletes vital energy needed for philosophical contemplation. Semen is described as containing pneuma, the vital spirit essential for mental clarity. Its waste through sexual activity is portrayed as literally draining intelligence from the body. These claims are delivered not as opinion but as established fact, complete with elaborate pseudo-biological explanations. Female initiates receive different but equally controlling messages. Their sexual energy is described as chaotic, requiring careful management to prevent disruption of the cosmic harmony the school seeks to maintain. Menstruation is treated as a form of ritual impurity. requiring separation from regular philosophical activities during polluted periods. The Stoics take a different approach, technically permitting sexual activity but stripping it of emotional content. The wise man will make love, but he will not be in love, teaches Seneca. Sex is reduced to a physical function, like eating or defecation, necessary but fundamentally unimportant, certainly not worth emotional investment. For you as an initiate, these teachings translate into concrete restrictions. You're forbidden from pursuing romantic relationships, not just with outsiders but especially with fellow students. The Pythagorean brotherhood is just that, a brotherhood with bonds supposedly higher and purer than romantic attachment. Any sign of special affection between initiates is swiftly punished as a distraction from true philosophical purpose. The punishment for detected sexual activity is severe across most schools. Pythagoreans might expel violators entirely, erasing their names from records as if they never existed. Stoics employ public confession and humiliation, forcing the offender to detail their failure of self-control before the entire school. Even the seemingly permissive cynics punish sexual attachment, as opposed to mere sexual activity, seeing emotional connection as a form of slavery to convention. Beyond sexuality, philosophical schools control all forms of human attachment. Family relationships are particularly targeted. Upon joining a school, you're expected to transfer your primary loyalty from your birth family to your philosophical community. Letters from home might be read aloud, annotated with philosophical critique, or simply confiscated. Requests to visit dying parents or siblings are often denied, with senior disciples explaining that attachment to biological family represents an unphilosophical concern with the physical rather than spiritual world. The most extreme relationship control occurs in mystery schools with philosophical elements, particularly Orphic and Bacchic cults. There, initiates undergo rituals deliberately designed to sever previous emotional bonds. In some mystery traditions, initiates must symbolically die to their former lives, including family connections, before being reborn into the philosophical community. These death-rebirth rituals often involve physical isolation, sensory deprivation, and guided visualizations where initiates imagine themselves detaching from loved ones. For married initiates, philosophical schools don't hesitate to interfere in the most intimate aspects of family life. Pythagoras prescribed specific sexual positions and frequencies for married followers. Stoic teachers might assign marriage exercises where couples practice emotional detachment even during intimacy. Some schools require spousal permission before accepting married students, then systematically work to make philosophy, not marriage, the primary relationship. Children present a particular challenge to philosophical control. Most schools discourage initiates from having children, seeing them as distractions from philosophical pursuit. Those who already have children face painful choices. Some schools demand complete separation, others allow limited contact under supervision, but none permit normal parent-child relationships to continue unaltered. The psychological impact of these relationship restrictions is devastating. Humans are social creatures. Isolation from meaningful connection creates vulnerability that philosophical schools exploit. Deprived of normal emotional outlets, initiates transfer attachment needs to the school itself, particularly to senior disciples and teachers who control access to approval and acceptance. This manufactured dependency isn't merely a side effect. It's a deliberate control mechanism. By positioning themselves as the sole source of meaningful connection, philosophical schools create powerful incentives for compliances. The threat of expulsion becomes not just a loss of educational opportunity but complete social death. Particularly insidious is the way these relationship controls are framed not as restrictions but as liberation. We free you from the bonds of conventional attachment, the cynics claim. We offer a relationship with universal rather than particular, the Stoics promise. This reframing transforms what is objectively isolation into a supposed philosophical achievement. As evening approaches, you notice changes in yourself. That letter from your mother that arrived weeks ago, still unanswered. It doesn't seem as important now. That attraction you felt toward another initiate. Shameful, unphilosophical. Your natural human need for connection is being systematically redirected, channeled exclusively toward the school and its teachings. This is the hidden mastery of philosophical relationship control. Not just prohibiting certain connections, but transforming the very nature of human attachment. Rebuilding it around the school's ideology until initiates cannot imagine meaningful existence outside the philosophical community. And with your emotional world now firmly under the school's control, you're perfectly positioned for the next level of philosophical discipline, one that reaches into the very words you write and thoughts you think. Morning arrives once again, but today brings a new form of philosophical torment, writing punishment. You might think that in schools dedicated to wisdom, the act of writing would be treated as sacred, a careful preservation of knowledge, a tool for clarifying thought. You'd be catastrophically wrong. In ancient philosophical schools, writing was weaponized as a particularly sophisticated form of punishment, one that tortured not just the body but the mind itself. And you're about to experience it firsthand. You're led to a small room furnished with nothing but a hard wooden bench, a slanted writing surface, and the tools of your impending suffering, wax tablets, a stylus, and several papyrus scrolls with accompanying ink and reed pens. A senior disciple places before you a philosophical text, perhaps a Pythagorean mathematical treatise, a Stoic ethical discourse, or a particularly obscure fragment of Heraclitus. "Copy this," he says simply, "without error." The task sounds straightforward until you begin. The text is dense, filled with specialized terminology and complex arguments. The script is small, requiring intense concentration. And the physical act of writing, particularly on papyrus with reed pens that must be constantly re-inked, is far more demanding than modern people realize. But the real torture isn't the writing itself. It's the standard to which you're held. Philosophical schools, particularly the Pythagoreans, demanded absolute perfection in copying. One smudged letter, one omitted word, one incorrectly formed character, and the entire work would be declared invalid. Not just the page, the entire scroll. Hours into your task, your back aches from hunching over the writing surface. Your fingers are cramped, stained with ink. Your eyes burn from straining to see in the inadequate light. And then it happens. A momentary lapse in concentration. A small blot of ink where it shouldn't be. You freeze, hoping it won't be noticed, knowing that hope is futile. The senior disciple, who has been silently watching, immediately spots the error. Without a word, he takes your nearly completed scroll and slowly, deliberately tears it to pieces. Hours of work destroyed in seconds. "Begin again," he says, placing a fresh scroll before you. This isn't just about creating perfect copies. It's about breaking your attachment to your own effort, your own pride in accomplishment. It's about teaching you that nothing you create has value unless it meets the school standards of perfection. It's psychological demolition disguised as scribal training. Some schools go further. After forcing initiates to spend days creating a perfect copy of a philosophical text, they might order them to destroy it themselves, to burn the scroll or dissolve the ink in mortar, watching as their work literally disappears. The lesson: attachment to physical manifestations of knowledge is unphilosophical. True wisdom exists in the mind, not on papyrus. The Stoics have their own version of writing punishment, focused less on technical perfection and more on content. You might be ordered to write detailed analyses of your own flaws, cataloguing every moment of weakness, every lapse in philosophical discipline. These confessional texts are then read aloud to the entire school, your deepest inadequacies made public for educational purposes. Even worse are writing punishments that target your original thoughts. If you've dared to express an idea that contradicts the school's doctrine, you might be forced to write refutations of your own thinking, dismantling your intellectual creation piece by piece. The psychological damage is profound. You're literally made to destroy your own mind's work. For initiates who show particular writing talent, there's a special form of torment, forced destruction of genuine creative work. A poem you've laboured over, a philosophical argument you've carefully constructed. You're ordered to burn it while reciting the reasons it's worthless. This isn't just destroying a physical object, it's forcing you to participate in the annihilation of your own intellectual identity. The physical component of writing punishment shouldn't be underestimated. Modern people, accustomed to keyboards and touchscreens, can barely imagine the physical strain of ancient writing. Reed pens must be constantly trimmed to maintain their point. Ink needs regular replenishing. Papyrus, if available at all, is expensive and easy to damage. Most practice happens on wax tablets that must be heated and smoothed for reuse. After hours of this work, your hand cramps into a claw-like position that can take days to fully straighten. Your shoulders and neck seize from maintaining the same hunch position. Your eyes blur from focusing on tiny characters in flickering lamplight. And that's assuming you're permitted normal working conditions. Sometimes writing punishment includes deliberate physical complications, standing rather than sitting, using your non-dominant hand, writing in uncomfortable positions, or working in extreme temperatures. The cynics, with their emphasis on enduring discomfort, might force students to write while exposed to the elements or in public places where concentration is constantly disrupted. As night approaches, you're still writing, your third attempt at a perfect copy. Your hand shakes with exhaustion, making errors more likely, creating a vicious cycle of failure and repetition. The senior disciple hasn't permitted you to eat. Completion must come before sustenance. Your stomach growls, your head pounds, but the scroll remains unfinished. Some initiates, broken by writing punishment, develop lasting psychological blocks around written expression. They become pathologically afraid of making mistakes, obsessively checking and rechecking their work. Others go to the opposite extreme, developing a nihilistic attitude toward intellectual creation. Nothing they produce matters anyway, so why invest emotionally in it? Both responses serve the philosophical school's purposes. Perfectionism makes initiates desperate for approval, constantly seeking validation from authority figures. Nihilism makes them malleable, willing to abandon their own thoughts in favor of the school's doctrines. Either way, intellectual independence is compromised. By the time you finally complete an acceptable copy, perhaps deep in the night, perhaps after multiple days of effort, you've learned the true lesson. Your thoughts, your efforts, your very intellectual identity exist at the mercy of the philosophical school. What you create can be destroyed in an instant. The only safety lies in perfect adherence to doctrine. And tomorrow, there will be another scroll, another test, another opportunity to demonstrate that you've internalized this painful lesson. The greatest philosophers wrote that wisdom sets us free, but in the schools that claim to teach wisdom, the path to enlightenment looks suspiciously like intellectual imprisonment. Just when you think you've experienced the full spectrum of philosophical torments, you encounter perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of ancient philosophical education, ritual punishment. These aren't simple penalties for breaking rules. They're elaborate, symbolically loaded ceremonies designed to imprint philosophical lessons through controlled trauma. Dawn hasn't yet broken when you're woken by a senior disciple, his face grave. The masters have found you lacking, he intones. Today you undergo the cleansing. No further explanation is offered as you're led from your sleeping area, still disoriented from being abruptly woken. Other initiates avoid eye contact as you pass, some making subtle warding gestures. Whatever is coming, it's serious enough to frighten even your fellow sufferers. You're brought to a part of the compound you've never entered before, a small, circular chamber beneath the main teaching hall. The space is dark, illuminated only by a few sputtering oil lamps that cast massive, distorted shadows on the walls. Several senior disciples wait in silence, their faces obscured by hoods. In the center of the room is a shallow pit filled with dark liquid. This is where philosophical education transforms into something closer to mystery religion, where punishment becomes ritual and psychological manipulation reaches its peak sophistication. Different schools have different ceremonies, but all share a common purpose: to create controlled psychological crisis that breaks down existing mental patterns and creates vulnerability to new ideas. The Pythagoreans were masters of ritual punishment. Their cleansing ceremony, which you're now facing, begins with complete sensory isolation. You're blindfolded, ears plugged with wax, and lowered into the pit, which contains not water but a thick mixture of mud and ash. The symbolism is explicit. You're being returned to primordial chaos, your identity dissolved in preparation for philosophical rebirth. You lie in this mixture for hours, unable to see, barely able to hear, the cold seeping into your bones. The sensory deprivation creates disorientation. Many initiates report hallucinations or distorted perception of time. This isn't an accidental side effect, it's the intended outcome. The mind, deprived of normal sensory input, becomes extraordinarily suggestible. When you're finally pulled from the pit, filthy and shivering, the next phase begins. Senior disciples surround you, chanting philosophical maxims in rhythmic unison. In your disoriented state, these words penetrate deeply, bypassing critical faculties. This is philosophical indoctrination at its most direct, not teaching through rational argument, but implanting ideas when resistance is lowest. The ceremony continues with symbolic death and rebirth. Your mud-covered body represents the impure soul clouded by misconception. You're drowned repeatedly in clean water, each immersion accompanied by the renunciation of a specific error in your thinking. I renounce attachment to the material. Dunk. I renounce the illusion of individuality. Dunk. I renounce knowledge gained outside the teachings. Dunk. By the time the ritual concludes, you're physically exhausted, emotionally overwrought, and psychologically altered. The experience has been designed to create what modern psychologists would call a dissociative state, a temporary interruption in normal consciousness that creates heightened responsiveness to authority and suggestion. The cynics approach ritual punishment differently, but with equal psychological sophistication. Their ceremonies often involve public humiliation elevated to theatrical levels. An initiate who has shown excessive concern for reputation might be subjected to the Diogenes treatment, dressed in rags, covered in filth, and ordered to beg from statues in the public square, while reciting philosophical paradoxes. The public spectacle isn't just embarrassing, it's a form of enforced liminality, placing the initiate outside normal social categories, neither fully citizen nor fully outcast. This liminal state, anthropologists recognize, is powerful for identity transformation. After experiencing complete social death, reintegration into the philosophical community feels like resurrection, creating powerful loyalty. Mystery schools with philosophical elements, particularly Orphic and Eleusinian traditions, developed even more elaborate ritual punishment. Initiates might undergo symbolic dismemberment, their limbs bound in positions of increasing discomfort, while teachers recited the myth of Dionysus torn apart by titans. The physical pain became a vehicle for identifying with the suffering god, creating emotional catharsis that the schools interpreted as spiritual breakthrough. What makes these ritual punishments particularly insidious is their deliberate confusion of boundaries between discipline, religious experience, and psychological conditioning. Initiates subjected to them often couldn't distinguish between genuine insight and suggestion, between spiritual awakening and traumatic reaction. The ceremonies were designed precisely to create this confusion, making participants unable to critically evaluate what was happening to them. Modern cult deprogrammers would recognize these techniques instantly. sensory manipulation, sleep disruption, hunger, isolation, public humiliation, and induced emotional catharsis are standard tools for breaking down identity and creating dependency. Ancient philosophical schools didn't have modern psychological terminology, but they discovered these mechanisms through centuries of trial and error. As your cleansing ritual concludes, you'll return to the main compound, still wrapped in wet cloths, shivering uncontrollably. Other initiates observe you with a mixture of fear and respect. You've survived an ordeal they either dread or remember. Senior disciples treat you differently now, with a certain solemn acknowledgement. Something has changed, though you struggle to articulate exactly what. In the days that follow, you notice subtle shifts in your thinking. Doctrines that previously seemed arbitrary now feel intuitively correct. Practices that once felt like punishments now seem necessary disciplines. The school's authority, once exterior and imposed, now feels internalized, as if their voice has become part of your inner dialogue. This transformation isn't accidental. It's the precise purpose of ritual punishment. Unlike simple disciplinary measures that correct specific behaviors, these ceremonies aim to fundamentally restructure the initiate's relationship with the philosophical school, transforming external compliance into internal identification. Most disturbing of all, these rituals often succeed. Human psychology is remarkably vulnerable to such methods, particularly when they combine physical stress, sensory manipulation, social pressure, and symbolic meaning. The initiates who emerge from these punishments aren't just cowed into obedience, they're converted, their very sense of self rebuilt around the school's doctrines. This is philosophy at its darkest, not the pursuit of wisdom through rational inquiry, but the systematic application of psychological techniques to break and rebuild human minds. And the most successful philosophical schools were those that most effectively mastered these techniques of transformation through controlled trawl. As you lie on your sleeping mat that night, still trembling occasionally from the cleansing, you might wonder why you don't simply leave, escape these elaborate torments. The answer is now inscribed in your psyche. There is no longer a clear you separate from the philosophical community. The punishments have done their work. Your rebirth is complete. When philosophical schools are depicted in movies or romanticized histories, they're usually shown as places difficult to enter, institutions with rigorous admission standards that test whether initiates are worthy to receive ancient wisdom. What's rarely shown is that they were often equally difficult, if not impossible, to leave. The ultimate philosophical punishment wasn't any specific physical or psychological torment, it was expulsion, a form of social and often literal death. You've endured months of the punishment regimen, the silence, the hunger, the public humiliation, the physical ordeals, the sleep deprivation, the writing punishments, the ritual cleansings. Through it all, you've managed to maintain some small core of independent thought, some tiny reservation about the school's absolute authority. Then one morning, everything changes. You're awakened before the others, a rare and ominous occurrence. 2 senior disciples escort you not to the usual morning assembly, but to a small, bare room you've never entered before. There sits the master himself, Pythagoras, Zeno, Diogenes, or whoever leads your particular school, flanked by his inner circle. Their faces are impassive, their posture rigid with authority. You've failed, the master announces without preamble. Your questions persist, your doubts remain. You cling to outside thinking. You are no longer welcome among us. The words hit like physical blows. After everything you've endured, after all the punishments and privations, you're being cast out. This isn't just academic dismissal, it's exile from the only community you now know, severance from the philosophical identity that has, despite your reservations, become central to your sense of self. Expulsion ceremonies varied between schools but shared a common purpose, to make leaving so traumatic that few would risk it, and those who were forced out would serve as cautionary examples. The Pythagoreans were particularly severe, practicing what modern scholars call social death for expelled members. When a Pythagorean was cast out, the school erected a small tomb bearing their name. Fellow initiates would gather around it, perform funeral rites, and declare the expelled person dead to the community. From that moment forward, if they encountered their former brother on the street, they would treat him as a ghost, as not speaking to him, not acknowledging his existence, walking past as if he were invisible. The psychological impact was devastating. In ancient society, identity was primarily social. You were defined by your place in a family, community, or philosophical school. To be suddenly without that place wasn't just inconvenient, it was an ontological crisis, a form of non-existence while still physically alive. The Stoics employed a more subtle but equally effective approach to expulsion. Rather than dramatic ceremonies, they practiced gradual ostracism. The offending student would find themselves increasingly excluded from discussions, seated farther from the teacher, addressed less frequently, until they existed on the periphery of a community that once embraced them. Many chose to leave voluntarily rather than endure this slow erasure, not realizing this was precisely the intended outcome. Cynics, true to their confrontational nature, made expulsion a public spectacle. An offending student might be stripped of their distinctive cynic cloak, staff, and pouch, the minimal possessions that marked them as philosophers, and physically driven from the gathering place with mockery and sometimes blows. The theatrical rejection served both to punish the individual and to reinforce group cohesion through shared participation in the exile. What made expulsion particularly cruel wasn't just the social isolation, but the comprehensive nature of the rejection. You weren't just leaving the school, you were being declared unworthy of philosophy itself. Given that most schools claimed exclusive access to truth, expulsion meant not just social death but intellectual and spiritual death as well. Permanent exile from wisdom, virtue, and the good life as the ancients defined it. Practically speaking, expulsion created immediate material hardship. Philosophical initiates often surrendered property upon joining, cut ties with family, and abandoned previous professions. An expelled member found themselves suddenly homeless, without resources, and carrying the stigma of philosophical failure, a serious liability in societies where philosophical schools held significant cultural influence. The most insidious aspect, however, was the psychological aftermath. After months or years of systematic conditioning, the punishments, the communal living, the doctrinal immersion, expelled members faced a profound identity crisis. Who were they without the philosophical community? What did they believe if not the school's teachings? Many experienced what modern psychologists would recognize as severe depression, disorientation, and even suicidal ideation. Some expelled members attempted to return, enduring additional humiliations for the privilege of reintegration. Others wandered from school to school, seeking acceptance that rarely came. Philosophical communities were well networked, and word of expulsion travelled quickly. Many simply disappeared, their fate unrecorded by histories more interested in successful philosophers than failed initiates. This threat of expulsion created a powerful control mechanism within philosophical schools. Initiates who witnessed the occasional banishment learned an essential lesson: compliance wasn't optional. The boundary between belonging and non-existence was razor-thin and could be crossed with a single misplaced question, a moment of doctrinal doubt, or failure to adequately perform philosophical exercises. As you stand before the master, hearing your sentence of expulsion, you realize the full scale of what you're losing. Your possessions, meager as they were, will remain with the school. Your writings will be destroyed or claimed by others. Your name will be struck from records. After all you've endured, the hunger, the silence, the physical ordeals, you face the cruelest punishment of all, erasure. There's a final cruel irony in philosophical expulsion. Many schools taught the worthlessness of social approval, the unimportance of belonging, the need to rise above conventional attachments. Yet these same schools weaponized social rejection as their ultimate sanction. The contradiction reveals the gap between philosophical theory and practice, between lofty ideals of self-sufficiency and the very human need for community, acceptance and identity. As you're escorted to the compound's gates, given nothing but the clothes on your back, you join the invisible ranks of philosophy's casualties, those who sought wisdom and found only rejection, who endured countless punishments only to face the final, unbearable one. Your journey into ancient philosophy has ended not with enlightenment but with exile, not with wisdom but with wounds that may never fully heal. And perhaps, as the gates close behind you, you realize the fundamental truth that philosophical schools worked so hard to obscure. True wisdom cannot be enforced through punishment, no matter how elaborate or severe. The path to understanding cannot be walked in chains. This realization, painful as it is, may be the only genuine philosophical insight you take from your ordeal. The punishments you've experienced, silence, hunger, sleep deprivation, public humiliation, physical ordeals, relationship control, writing punishments, ritual ceremonies, and the threat of expulsion aren't random cruelties. They're expressions of philosophy's darkest, most carefully guarded secret. The master-student relationship was fundamentally about power, and the philosophical school was a hierarchy designed to preserve and enhance that power. On this particular morning you witness a disturbing demonstration of how this hierarchical abuse functions. A senior disciple summons several initiates, including you, to the central courtyard. There stands the master, flanked by his inner circle. Before him kneels an initiate, head bowed in submission. Theon has questioned the doctrine of transmigration, announces the senior disciple. He has expressed doubt about the soul's journey after death. The master's face remains impassive, but the atmosphere crackles with tension. Everyone present knows what follows isn't simply correction, but a performance of dominance, a ritual reinforcement of the philosophical hierarchy. What happens next varies by school, but the essence remains consistent: public humiliation as philosophical theatre. In Pythagorean schools, the errant student might be forced to stand perfectly still while the master and senior disciples take turns pointing out his intellectual and moral failings, each criticism delivered in a calm, measured tone that makes it impossible to dismiss as mere anger. The public dissection continues until the student is visibly broken, often weeping openly, sometimes physically collapsing. The Cynics preferred more theatrical demonstrations. Diogenes was known to mock students mercilessly, imitating their mannerisms, parodying their questions, even urinating on those who displeased him, all while delivering philosophical commentary on their failures. This wasn't just cruelty, it was teaching through shock, deliberately shattering social conventions to demonstrate philosophical points. Even the relatively moderate peripatetics and academics engaged in sophisticated forms of intellectual domination. Aristotle reportedly assigned different readings to different students, then questioned them publicly on materials they hadn't been given, demonstrating their ignorance while enhancing his own authority. Plato used dialectical questioning not just to guide students toward insight, but to trap them in contradictions, publicly dismantling their intellectual confidence. What makes these hierarchical abuses particularly effective is their philosophical justification. They aren't presented as expressions of personal power, but as necessary components of philosophical education. The student isn't being humiliated, he's being freed from false opinions. He isn't being dominated, he's being guided toward truth. The language of philosophy provides perfect cover for what is, essentially, systematic emotional abuse. This dynamic extends beyond formal punishments to everyday interactions within the school. Masters and senior disciples create elaborate systems of favoritism and scapegoating, elevating certain students while marginalizing others. Today's favored initiate might be tomorrow's example of failure, creating an atmosphere of constant uncertainty and competition. The arbitrary nature of this treatment isn't accidental, it's strategically valuable. When praise and punishment appear random rather than predictable, students develop what psychologists now call learned helplessness, abandoning attempts to control their situation through their own actions. Instead, they focus obsessively on pleasing authority figures, whose approval becomes the only stable reference point in an unpredictable environment. What's particularly disturbing about philosophical hierarchy isn't just its psychological sophistication, but its comprehensive nature. Unlike purely religious or political systems, philosophical schools claim dominion over every aspect of human experience: intellectual, physical, social, emotional, and spiritual. No part of the student's life or identity remained untouched by the master's authority. The Stoics, for instance, taught that emotions themselves should be controlled through reason, a seemingly benign idea until you realize that reason was defined by the school's doctrines, effectively giving masters authority over students' emotional responses. Feel grief at a parent's death. That's unphilosophical attachment. Experience anger at injustice. That's failure to accept fate. Every natural human reaction becomes subject to philosophical judgment and correction. Physical appearance, too, falls under philosophical control. Each school prescribes specific dress, grooming, and deportment. Pythagoreans must wear white, avoid wool, and enter rooms right foot first. Cynics must adopt deliberate dishevelment, unwashed, ungroomed, minimally clothed. Stoics must maintain a specific facial expression reflecting apatheia, freedom from passion. These requirements aren't just symbolic, they're extensions of the master's control over students' embodied existence. Even speech patterns become vectors for hierarchical enforcement. Philosophical schools develop distinctive vocabularies, sentence structures, and rhetorical styles. Speaking in the approved manner isn't just about clarity, it's about demonstrating submission to the school's linguistic authority. Students who retain regional accents or grammatical idiosyncrasies from their pre-philosophical life face correction that has nothing to do with comprehensibility and everything to do with conformity. The hierarchical relationship reaches its most disturbing expression in the practice of philosophical examination. In many schools, students must regularly submit to interrogation about their private thoughts, dreams, impulses, and doubts. Unlike religious confession, which offers absolution, philosophical examination often leads to additional punishments for incorrect thinking, creating powerful incentives for students to report only thoughts that align with doctrine. You watch as Theon, the student who questioned transmigration, receives his public correction. The master speaks calmly, reasonably, his words precise and measured. Yet Theon's face crumples in shame, his body language conveying complete defeat. This isn't education, it's dominance performance, the philosophical equivalent of an animal displaying its belly in submission. The most perverse aspect of philosophical hierarchy is how it recruits victims into perpetuating the system. Today's humiliated student becomes tomorrow's enforcer, eagerly identifying doctrinal errors in newer initiates. Having survived the breaking process, senior disciples develop psychological investment in the hierarchical structure that now gives them relative privilege. The abused become abusers, ensuring the system's continuation. This transformation isn't accidental. It's the culmination of philosophical education. The perfect student isn't one who attains independent wisdom, but one who so thoroughly internalizes the master's authority that they become its willing instrument. The philosophical school doesn't create philosophers, it creates philosophical clones, each generation reproducing the thoughts, methods, and hierarchical practices of its predecessors. As Theon's humiliation concludes, you notice something disturbing. His expression has shifted from shame to gratitude. He thanks the master for the correction, declaring himself enlightened by the experience. This isn't Stockholm Syndrome, it's philosophical conversion. He genuinely believes the domination he just experienced was necessary for his intellectual development. And perhaps most chilling of all, part of you envies his certainty, his belonging, his clear place in the hierarchy. After all you've endured, the psychological restructuring has at least partially succeeded. You haven't just witnessed hierarchical abuse, you've begun to accept it as normal, even necessary. This is the final, darkest punishment of ancient philosophical schools. They make you complicit in your own subjugation, grateful for your chains, and eager to bind others in the name of wisdom. You've survived a day in an ancient philosophical school. Your body aches from physical ordeals. Your mind reels from sleep deprivation. Your stomach growls from deliberate hunger, and your psyche bears the invisible wounds of systematic manipulation. As the sun sets on this grueling experience, it's time to consider a question. What does this journey through philosophical punishment tell us about the nature of wisdom, education, and humanity itself? The philosophical schools of antiquity have left us a paradoxical legacy. From their harsh compounds emerge some of history's most profound insights about ethics, metaphysics, politics, and human nature. Thinkers who endured these punitive regimens produced works that still illuminate the human condition thousands of years later. The same institutions that practiced psychological manipulation also cultivated intellectual rigor, analytical precision, and genuine philosophical innovation. How do we reconcile these contradictions? How do we separate the wisdom from the wounds, the insights from the abuses? Perhaps the first step is recognizing that ancient philosophical schools weren't primarily educational institutions as we understand them today. They were totalizing communities designed to transform identity through immersive experience. Their goal wasn't just to teach philosophy, but to create philosophers, to rebuild human beings according to specific ideological blueprints. This transformative ambition explains the severity of their methods. Mere intellectual instruction wouldn't suffice to create the profound character changes these schools sought. Only through comprehensive restructuring of daily life, including diet, sleep, social relations, and physical experience, could they hope to produce the distinctive types of individuals they envisioned: the disciplined Pythagorean, the emotionally controlled Stoic, the convention-defying cynic. The punishments weren't incidental to philosophical education, they were central to it. Physical ordeals weren't just discipline for misconduct. They were deliberate induction of suffering designed to test philosophical principles in embodied experience. Could you maintain equanimity while kneeling on sharp stones? Could you practice detachment while enduring public humiliation? Philosophy wasn't just something to think about, it was something to live, even, perhaps especially, when living it hurt. This integration of punishment into education reflected a fundamental ancient belief. True learning requires suffering. Knowledge gained easily wasn't trusted. Wisdom acquired without personal cost wasn't valued. Ancient philosophers believed that painful experiences inscribed lessons more deeply than pleasant ones, a view partially supported by modern psychological research on memory formation under stress. But this educational philosophy came with severe costs. The systematic application of punishment created power dynamics that undermined the very critical thinking philosophical schools claimed to cultivate. Students taught to accept authority through punitive conditioning often became dogmatic rather than questioning, obedient rather than innovative. The means contradicted the ends, creating philosophers who could recite doctrines perfectly but struggled to think truly independently. More disturbing still was the way philosophical punishments selected for psychological traits that had nothing to do with wisdom. Those who thrived in these environments weren't necessarily the most intelligent or insightful. They were those most capable of enduring physical discomfort, most responsive to social pressure, and most willing to subordinate their identities to institutional demands. The philosophical schools didn't just teach philosophy, they filtered humanity according to specific psychological profiles. The survivors of this system, those who endured the punishments and eventually became teachers themselves, often institutionalized the very practices that had traumatized them. Having justified their own suffering as necessary for philosophical progress, they inflicted similar suffering on the next generation, creating cycles of philosophical trauma masked as education. This pattern isn't unique to ancient philosophy. It recurs throughout educational history, from medieval universities to modern academic hazing. Yet despite these troubling dynamics, Genuine philosophical insights did emerge from these punitive environments. Some students, having endured systematic breakdown of their previous identities, experienced profound cognitive restructuring that enabled truly original thinking. Others found in physical ordeals a laboratory for testing abstract principles against embodied reality, developing nuanced understandings impossible through pure theory. Perhaps most significantly, the communal nature of philosophical punishment, with students enduring shared ordeals, created intense bonds that facilitated intellectual collaboration. Ideas weren't developed by isolated thinkers, but by closely connected communities forged through common experience, including common suffering. The physical proximity enforced by philosophical schools, however coercively maintained, enabled sustained dialogue that produced transformative insights. The philosophical schools also provided something vanishingly rare in the ancient world: social mobility based on intellectual merit rather than birth. Despite their harshness, schools like the Academy or the Lyceum offered paths to respect and influence for those from humble origins, provided they could endure the punishing regimen. The same systems that broke students down also, selectively, lifted them up. So what would you take away from your day in an ancient philosophical school? Perhaps not just traumatic memories, but also genuine insights about human resilience, the relationship between physical experience and abstract thought, and the complex interplay between individual identity and communal belonging. These insights wouldn't come, despite the punishments, but through them. Painful knowledge inscribed in body and mind. This doesn't justify the abuses. The systematic application of suffering as educational methodology remains ethically problematic regardless of its outcomes. Modern philosophy, with good reason, has largely abandoned these punitive approaches in favor of more humane pedagogies. Today's philosophy seminar, with its comfortable chairs and respectful discourse, bears little resemblance to the harsh compounds of antiquity. Yet something has been lost in this transition. Modern philosophical education, while more accessible and less traumatic, rarely achieves the identity-transforming impact of ancient schools. Contemporary philosophy students study philosophy. Ancient initiates became philosophers, their entire lives reorganized around philosophical principles. The depth of commitment, for better and worse, was incomparably greater. As you reflect on your journey through philosophical punishment, perhaps the most valuable insight is this: wisdom has always been costly. Not because suffering is inherently enlightening, but because transformative knowledge requires transformative experience. The ancient philosophical schools, for all their cruelty, recognized that changing how humans think requires changing how they live, a principle modern education often neglects in its focus on information transfer rather than holistic transformation. You wouldn't last a day in an ancient philosophical school, few modern people would. Our expectations of comfort, autonomy, and basic respect make their punitive regimens utterly intolerable to contemporary sensibilities. But perhaps in our justified rejection of their methods, we've also lost sight of their most profound insight, that philosophy isn't just something we know, but something we become, through experiences that reach beyond the intellect to transform our entire being. The philosophical punishments of antiquity stand as both warning and challenge, warning against the dangers of authoritarian education, challenge to create transformative learning environments that foster wisdom without inflicting trauma. In navigating between these poles, we might yet discover approaches to philosophical education that honor both the depth of ancient practice and the humanity of modern ethics. As the sun sets on your philosophical ordeal, you carry with you not just bruises and hunger pangs, but a visceral understanding of why these ancient schools, despite their cruelty, or perhaps because of it, shaped minds that still speak to us across millennia. Their methods were unforgivable, but their ambition, to create human beings whose lives embodied their philosophical principles, remains a profound challenge to our more comfortable, and perhaps more superficial, approach to wisdom.